The autumn wind carried whispers through the magnolia trees of Thornhill Plantation, where desperation wore silk dresses and shame hid behind closed shutters. In the fading light of 1847, Constance Whitmore stood at her bedroom window, watching the last carriage disappear down the Oakline Drive. Another suitor, another rejection. Her 4 daughters, Margaret, Elizabeth, Caroline, and young Abigail, remained unmarried, and with each passing season, the vultures circled closer. Her late husband's brother, Edmund Whitmore, had made his intentions clear. Without a male heir, Thornhill would pass to him within the year. The thought of that cruel, ambitious man controlling everything her beloved Thomas had built made her blood run cold. She had wealth, land, and influence, but none of it mattered without the one thing society demanded: a grandson to carry the Whitmore name. The neighboring families had already begun their cruel gossip. 4 daughters, all past 20, all unwed, all seemingly cursed to spinsterhood. Margaret, at 28, had been jilted 3 times. Elizabeth's sharp tongue had driven away every potential match. Caroline's melancholy made her seem half alive at social gatherings. And Abigail, sweet Abigail, at 22, was too timid to even meet a gentleman's eyes. Constance had tried everything: balls, introductions, even lowering her standards considerably, but nothing worked. Time was running out, and Edmund's lawyers were already preparing documents. That's when the idea came to her. Dark and terrible, and absolutely necessary. If her daughters couldn't attract husbands, she would ensure they had children another way. She would buy a slave for one purpose only: the decision that would shake Thornhill to its foundations was made on a Tuesday evening over brandy that Constance drank alone in Thomas's old study. She had dismissed the notion a dozen times, but it kept returning like a persistent ghost. Society would never accept bastard children as heirs under normal circumstances. But Constance had already thought of that. She would claim the children as her own. A miracle pregnancy at 46 would raise eyebrows, but it was possible. Or she could arrange hasty, quiet marriages for her daughters to distant, poor gentlemen who would accept generous settlements in exchange for giving their names to children not their own. The details could be managed. What mattered was getting those children, and getting them quickly. She needed a man who was young, healthy, strong, and completely under her control. A slave fit all those requirements. The thought made her stomach turn, but she pushed the feeling aside. This wasn't about morality. This was about survival. She rang for her house manager, a thin, efficient woman named Mrs. Hartwell, who had served the family for 30 years and knew how to keep secrets. When Mrs. Hartwell entered, Constance didn't waste time with pleasantries. She needed the woman to make discreet inquiries at the slave markets in Charleston. She needed a specific type of man, and she needed him within the month. Mrs. Hartwell's face remained carefully neutral as she listened, though her hands trembled slightly as she took notes. Before you judge what happens next, leave a comment below about what you would do in Constance's position. Would you fight for your family's survival by any means necessary? Or would you let everything fall into the hands of a cruel man who would destroy your late husband's legacy? The purchase was made on a cold November morning when fog rolled off the Ashley River like the breath of ghosts. Constance didn't attend herself. That would have been too conspicuous. But Mrs. Hartwell went with explicit instructions and a purse, heavy with gold coins. The man she returned with was named Samuel, though that name had been given to him by a previous owner and meant nothing to him. He was 24 years old, tall and powerfully built from years of field work, with dark eyes that held both intelligence and a carefully cultivated blankness. He had been sold 3 times in his life, each time learning to show less of himself, to become whatever his owners needed him to be, to survive. Mrs. Hartwell had chosen well. Samuel was healthy, strong, and notably, he could read a dangerous skill for a slave, one that his previous owners hadn't known about. He had taught himself in secret, stealing moments with discarded newspapers and books, understanding instinctively that knowledge was the only weapon he might ever possess. When he arrived at Thornhill, he was taken not to the slave quarters, but to a small, isolated cabin near the edge of the property, far from the main house and the other workers. Constance met him there as the sun was setting, her face veiled, her hands shaking, despite her attempts at composure. She had rehearsed this moment, planned what she would say, but now, facing this man whose life she had purchased for the most intimate of purposes, the words stuck in her throat. Samuel stood silently, his eyes downcast as he had been trained, waiting. He had learned long ago that white people, especially white women, needed to feel in control of every interaction. Finally, Constance spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. She explained what she needed from him, laying out the arrangement with clinical precision. He would be kept separate from the other slaves. He would be well fed, well lodged, and given comforts far beyond what any slave could normally expect. In return, he would perform one duty. He would impregnate her 4 daughters. Once each daughter was confirmed with child, his service would be complete. She promised that afterward she would sell him to an owner in the north, someone she knew who treated their slaves with relative kindness. It was the closest thing to freedom she could offer, without actually granting it. Samuel listened without reaction, his face a mask. Inside, his mind raced through the implications, the dangers, the slim possibilities. This was an opportunity, twisted and terrible as it was, but still an opportunity. He had survived worse. He would survive this. When Constance finished speaking, she waited for his response, though they both knew he had no real choice in the matter. After a long moment, Samuel raised his eyes to meet hers, a bold gesture that made her step back, and spoke his first words to her in a voice deeper and more educated than she expected. "I understand, ma'am. I'll do as you ask, but I got one question." Constance, startled by his directness and his articulate speech, nodded hesitantly. Samuel continued, choosing his words carefully. "These daughters of yours, do they know what you're planning? Do they agree to this?" It was a question Constance had been avoiding in her own mind. The truth was complicated. She had approached Margaret first, her eldest, and laid out the desperate situation. Margaret, pragmatic and hardened by her romantic failures, had agreed almost immediately. Elizabeth had raged and refused, then spent 3 days locked in her room before emerging with red eyes and a curt acceptance. Caroline had simply stared out the window and whispered that she didn't care what happened to her anymore. Abigail had cried, begged for another solution, but ultimately submitted to her mother's will, as she always did. They knew they had agreed in their various ways, but calling it agreement felt like a lie when the alternative was watching their home and security be stripped away by Uncle Edmund. Constance told Samuel, a simplified version, that her daughters understood the necessity and had consented. She didn't mention the tears, the arguments, the way Elizabeth had looked at her with something close to hatred. Samuel nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. He had expected as much. White folks always found ways to justify what they did, to make their cruelty sound like necessity. But he had also learned that, in the cracks of their justifications, there was sometimes room to maneuver, to find small advantages, to plant seeds that might one day grow into something more. Over the next week, Samuel was kept in isolation while Constance made preparations. The cabin was furnished with unexpected comforts, a real bed, warm blankets, books that Mrs. Hartwell claimed were there by accident, but which Samuel suspected were a test. He read them anyway, no longer caring about hiding his abilities. If this situation was going to be as twisted as it seemed, he might as well stop pretending to be less than he was. The first daughter came to him on a moonless night in late November. It was Margaret, the eldest, who approached the cabin with shoulders squared and jaw set like a soldier going to battle. She entered without knocking, closed a door behind her, and stood in the lamplight. looking at Samuel with an expression of mixed defiance, shame, and something else he couldn't quite identify. For a long moment, neither spoke. The weight of what was about to happen filled the small space like a physical presence. Finally, Margaret broke the silence with words that surprised them both. "My mother bought you like livestock to use for breeding. I want you to know that I find that abhorrent, even as I'm here to participate in it. I want you to know that I see the wrongness of this, even though I'm not strong enough to refuse." Samuel had expected many things: coldness, disgust, silent resignation, but not this, not acknowledgement, not something that almost sounded like an apology. He studied her face, seeing past the harsh exterior to the desperation underneath. Margaret was not a beautiful woman by the standards of her society. Her features were too strong, her manner too direct. But there was something compelling about her honesty in this moment. He made a decision then, one that would set the tone for everything that followed. He would not pretend this was normal. He would not make it easy for any of them to forget what was really happening. "Then we both know what this is," Samuel said quietly. "Your mother owns my body, and she's lending it to you because you need something from it. That's the truth of it. We can pretend it's something else, or we can just be honest about the wrong we're both part of." Margaret flinched at his words, but she didn't look away. "You're right, and I have no defense except that I'm a coward who values her comfort more than her principles." Something shifted in the room then, a strange understanding, passing between two people trapped in an impossible situation. What happened that night was not gentle, but it was not entirely cold either. There was a strange, sad intimacy in their shared acknowledgement of the wrongness, in Margaret's refusal to pretend this was anything other than what it was, and in Samuel's decision to treat her as a person rather than just another owner. When she left before dawn, Margaret paused at the door. "Thank you," she said, then immediately shook her head. "No, that's not right. There's no thanking someone for something like this. I'll remember that you're a person. I'll remember that." Samuel didn't respond, but after she was gone, he sat on the edge of the bed and allowed himself to feel the full weight of what his life had become. He was a stud animal, purchased for breeding, and yet somehow, in the midst of that dehumanization, he had just experienced something almost human. The next daughter came 3 nights later. Elizabeth arrived like a storm, slamming the cabin door and pacing like a caged animal. She was the beauty of the family with golden hair and fine features, but her face was twisted with rage and self-loathing. "I hate this," she spat before Samuel could say anything. "I hate my mother for arranging it. I hate myself for agreeing. I hate you for being part of it. I hate everything about this cursed situation." Samuel watched her rage, saying nothing. He had learned long ago that sometimes white people needed to perform their emotions, to make noise, to convince themselves they still felt something. Elizabeth continued her tirade, words pouring out in a bitter stream about her failed courtships, about the men who had wanted her beauty but couldn't tolerate her intelligence, about a society that valued her only as an ornamental vessel for children. Finally, she collapsed into the cabin's single chair, her fury spent, replaced by hollow exhaustion. "Get it over with," she said flatly. "Do what you're here to do." But Samuel didn't move. Instead, he spoke in that same quiet, educated voice that had surprised Constance. "You know what's interesting about anger like yours? It's not really about me. You're angry because you finally see the cage you've been in your whole life. You're angry because you're not that different from me. You're just property of a different kind, traded and used for what your body can produce." Elizabeth's head snapped up, her eyes blazing. "How dare you compare?" But she stopped mid-sentence, the words dying on her lips as the truth of what he'd said hit her. She had been raised to believe she was superior, that her white skin and family name made her fundamentally different from slaves. But in this moment, in this cabin, the lie fell apart. She too was being used for breeding. She too had no real choice. The parallel was undeniable and horrifying. Tears began to stream down her face, not delicate crying, but harsh, angry sobs. Samuel remained still, letting her feel it. When she finally looked up at him again, something in her expression had changed. The hatred was still there, but it was no longer directed at him. What followed between them that night was different from what had happened with Margaret. There was more anger in it, more resistance, but also a strange kind of equality in their shared powerlessness. When Elizabeth left, she didn't thank him or acknowledge him, but the next night she returned, not because Constance had sent her, but of her own accord. "I need to understand something," she said, standing in the doorway. "How do you bear it? Being owned, being used, having no control over your own life?" Samuel considered the question carefully. "You find the small spaces where you still got choices. You hold on to the parts of yourself they can't touch, and you wait for chances, even if they never come." They talked through most of the night, Elizabeth asking questions she had never dared ask before, Samuel answering with an honesty that surprised them both. By the time she left at dawn, something had shifted between them. Not friendship exactly, but a recognition of shared humanity in the midst of inhumanity. The third daughter, Caroline, came the following week. She drifted into the cabin like a ghost, her movements slow and dreamlike. She was pale and thin, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and an inner darkness that Samuel recognized immediately. He had seen it before in slaves who had given up, who had retreated so far inside themselves that they barely inhabited their own bodies anymore. Caroline didn't speak. She simply began to undress with mechanical movements. Her eyes focused on nothing. Samuel stopped her, gently catching her hands. "Wait," he said. "Just wait a minute." She looked at him with empty eyes. "Why? Let's just do what we're supposed to do. Nothing matters anyway." "Everything matters," Samuel said, surprising himself with the intensity in his voice. "That's the lie they tell us, that we don't matter, that our pain doesn't count, that we're just things to be used. But it's not true." For the first time, Caroline seemed to actually see him. "You're a slave," she whispered. "How can you say everything matters when you have nothing?" "Because I'm still here," Samuel replied. "Because I still feel, still think, still hope, even when hope seems stupid. Because if I let them take that from me, then they've won completely." Something flickered in Caroline's dead eyes. Not hope exactly, but perhaps the memory of what hope felt like. Over the following nights, Samuel made it his mission to pull Caroline back from whatever edge she was teetering on. He talked to her, shared stories from his life, asked her questions that forced her to engage. Slowly, painfully, she began to emerge from her fog. She told him about the melancholy that had plagued her since childhood, about feeling like she was watching life through thick glass, never quite able to touch or be touched by the world. She told him about the doctor who had prescribed laudanum, and how the medicine had made everything worse, trapping her in a haze she couldn't escape. Samuel, drawing on knowledge he had gained from a previous owner who had been a physician, recognized the signs of addiction. He convinced her to reduce her doses gradually, sitting with her through the difficult nights when her body craved the drug. Their time together became less about the purpose Constance had intended and more about Caroline's slow, painful journey back to herself. When she finally did conceive, it was almost incidental to the real transformation happening. Caroline was learning to live again. The youngest daughter, Abigail, was the last to come, and she came trembling with fear. At 22, she was the baby of the family, sheltered and timid, terrified of everything from thunderstorms to raised voices. She stood in the cabin doorway crying, unable to even step inside. Samuel, who by now had spent weeks in this strange role, felt something shift in him. With Margaret, he had found unexpected honesty. With Elizabeth, he had discovered intellectual kinship. With Caroline, he had become a healer of sorts. But with Abigail, he felt something more protective, almost gentle. He didn't invite her in or make demands. Instead, he simply talked to her from across the threshold, his voice soft and unthreatening. He told her stories, not about slavery or hardship, but about beautiful things he had seen. A sunrise over rice fields that had turned the sky purple and gold. A bird he had once watched build a nest. The smell of jasmine on summer nights. Patiently and determinedly, Abigail's fear began to ease. She started to step inside the cabin, to sit, to talk. She told him about her fears, about how the world seemed too big and too frightening, about how she had always felt too fragile for the life she was supposed to live. Samuel listened and understood, something that her family had never grasped. Abigail wasn't weak. She was just sensitive, in a world that had no patience for sensitivity. When intimacy finally happened between them, it was the gentlest of all his encounters. And afterward, Abigail did something none of her sisters had done. She fell asleep in the cabin, curled up beside him, like she felt safe for the first time in her life. But safety was an illusion at Thornhill, and the fragile world Samuel and the sisters had created was about to shatter. The first crack came when one of the field slaves, a man named Joseph, who worked as a stable hand, noticed the unusual traffic to and from the isolated cabin. Curious and concerned, he began to watch more carefully. What he saw disturbed him deeply. The master's daughters visiting a male slave in secret. Night after night, Joseph faced a terrible dilemma. Among the slave community, there was an unspoken rule. You didn't betray your own to the masters. But this situation was different. If the masters discovered this on their own, the punishment for Samuel would be death, probably by torture. The daughters might be ruined, but Samuel would definitely be killed. Joseph decided to approach Samuel directly, catching him one morning as he fetched water. "Brother, I don't know what you got yourself into, but you need to know people are starting to notice. And if the wrong people notice, you're a dead man." Samuel felt ice in his veins. He had been so focused on the strange relationships developing with the sisters that he had forgotten the most basic rule of survival. Always watch your back. He thanked Joseph, and immediately began to think through his options. But before he could act, fate intervened in the form of Edmund Whitmore, Constance's brother-in-law, who arrived at Thornhill unannounced for what he called a family visit, but which everyone understood was really a reconnaissance mission to assess his future property. Edmund was a tall, cold man with calculating eyes and a reputation for cruelty to his own slaves. He had been waiting for Constance to fail, counting the days until Thornhill would be his. What he didn't expect was to find Constance looking remarkably unconcerned about her deadline, almost smug, in fact. His suspicions aroused, Edmund began to investigate. He questioned servants, observed routines, and noticed the same things Joseph had noticed: the isolated cabin, the nighttime visits, the way Constance seemed to be protecting some secret. When he finally pieced together what was happening, his reaction was not the moral outrage one might expect. Instead, Edmund saw opportunity. He confronted Constance in her study, laying out what he had discovered with cold precision. "You've bought a slave to breed with your daughters like their livestock. The scandal alone would destroy this family if it became public. But more than that, any children born from such unions could never legally inherit Thornhill. You've accomplished nothing except ensuring your own ruin." Constance, who had faced down many challenges in her life, felt real fear for the first time in months. Edmund continued, his voice smooth as poison. "However, I'm prepared to be reasonable. Sign over Thornhill to me now, quietly, and I'll keep your shameful secret. Your daughters can live out their lives in a small house in Charleston with enough money to survive. The slave, of course, will have to be disposed of. We can't risk him talking." The casual way Edmund spoke of murdering Samuel made Constance's blood run cold. She had done terrible things to protect her family, had compromised her morals, in ways that would haunt her forever, but she had never intended for Samuel to die. In that moment, she realized that in trying to save Thornhill through any means necessary, she had become someone she didn't recognize, someone capable of treating a human being as a tool to be used and discarded. But before she could respond to Edmund's ultimatum, the study door burst open, and Elizabeth strode in, her face flushed with anger. She had been listening at the door, a habit from childhood that she had never quite broken. "No," Elizabeth said firmly. "We're not signing anything over to you, Uncle, and you're not touching Samuel." Edmund laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "My dear niece, you have no say in this matter. Your mother's foolish scheme has failed, and now my mother's scheme hasn't failed," Elizabeth interrupted. "Margaret is with child. So am I. Caroline and Abigail will be soon, if they aren't already. In a few months, there will be heirs to Thornhill, and your claim will be worthless." The room fell silent. Constance stared at her daughter in shock. She hadn't known the pregnancies were confirmed yet. Edmund's face darkened with rage. "Bastards," he spat. "Children born from a slave can't inherit. The law is clear." "The law is clear about children born to slave mothers," Elizabeth countered, her voice steady, despite her racing heart. "But children born to white mothers of good family, that's a different matter entirely. Especially if those mothers claim the father was a white man, perhaps someone passing through. Someone whose identity we choose not to reveal to protect the family honor." Edmund's eyes narrowed. "No one will believe. Everyone will believe what they want to believe," Elizabeth said. "Society would much rather accept the story of indiscretions with mysterious white strangers than face the alternative. We'll be scandalous, certainly, pitied, probably. But our children will be white in the eyes of the law, and they will inherit." It was a brilliant argument, and Edmund knew it. The antebellum South ran on convenient fictions and willful blindness. White society would absolutely prefer to believe in fallen women and secret affairs rather than acknowledge what had really happened. But Edmund wasn't finished. And what about the slave? He knows the truth. As long as he lives, he's a threat to your story. This was the moment Elizabeth had been preparing for, the reason she had burst into the study in the first place. "That's why Samuel needs to disappear before you can get your hands on him," she said. "And he needs to disappear tonight." Constance finally found her voice. "Elizabeth, what are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we give him what you promised, freedom, real freedom. Not just a sale to a kinder master. We help him escape north. Give him enough money to start a new life, and he takes the truth with him." Edmund laughed again. "You're talking about helping a slave escape. That's a crime. If you're caught, you'll lose everything anyway." "Only if we're caught," Margaret said, stepping into the study from the hallway, where she too had been listening. "And we won't be, because you're going to help us, Uncle." Edmund stared at his nieces in disbelief. "Why in God's name would I help you?" Margaret smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Because if you don't, we'll tell everyone the truth. We'll stand up in church and confess everything, the slave, the pregnancies, all of it. We'll destroy the Whitmore name so completely that even you won't be able to salvage anything from the wreckage. Thornhill will be worthless to you, just a plantation with a scandal, so dark that no respectable person would ever associate with anyone connected to it." It was mutually assured destruction, and Edmund knew it. These women, whom he had dismissed as weak and manageable, were prepared to burn everything down rather than let him win. The standoff lasted for several long moments, tension crackling in the air like lightning before a storm. Finally, Edmund spoke, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "What exactly do you want from me?" Over the next hour, they hammered out an agreement. Edmund would use his connections to arrange safe passage for Samuel on a ship leaving Charleston for Philadelphia. He would provide documents claiming Samuel was a freed man. In exchange, the sisters would never speak of what had really happened, would maintain the fiction of mysterious white fathers, and would allow Edmund to save face by claiming he had graciously agreed to let Constance retain Thornhill out of family loyalty. It was a compromise that left everyone unhappy, which meant it was probably the best solution available. But the hardest part was still to come, telling Samuel. That night, all four sisters went to the cabin together, an unprecedented occurrence that immediately put Samuel on alert. When they explained what had been arranged, his reaction surprised them. "You want me to run?" he said slowly. "To leave everything I know, everyone I know, and trust that your uncle, a man who wanted me dead this morning, will actually help me get north instead of just selling me downriver or killing me quietly." "Yes," Elizabeth said simply. "I know it's asking you to trust the untrustworthy, but it's the only chance you have." Samuel looked at each of them in turn. Margaret with her pragmatic strength, Elizabeth with her fierce intelligence, Caroline with her hard-won vitality, and Abigail with her gentle courage. These women had been strangers to him weeks ago, then captors of a sort, then something more complicated. "And what about the children?" he asked quietly. "What happens to them?" It was the question none of the sisters had wanted to face directly. Abigail answered, tears streaming down her face. "They'll be raised as Whitmores. They'll never know the truth about their father. They'll be taught that they're better than slaves, that they're part of the system that kept you in chains. And there's nothing we can do about that without destroying them along with ourselves." The cruelty of it hit Samuel like a physical blow. He would have children in this world, 4 children, probably, and they would grow up not knowing him, possibly growing up to be the kind of people who would own slaves themselves. It was a special kind of torture, and yet, what choice did he have? Stay and die, or run and live with the knowledge of what he was leaving behind? "There's one more thing," Margaret said, pulling a leather pouch from her cloak. "We've pooled our jewelry, everything of value we own. It's not a fortune, but it's enough to start a life up north. Enough to maybe buy a small shop, or learn a trade." Samuel took the pouch, feeling the weight of it. It was more money than he had ever held in his life, more than he had ever imagined possessing. But it felt like blood money, payment for services rendered, a price on his children's lives. "I need to say goodbye to Joseph," Samuel said, "and a few others, people who've been kind to me, who deserve to know I'm not just disappearing." The sisters agreed, and over the next few hours, Samuel made his quiet farewells. Joseph gripped his hand hard, understanding without words what was happening. An old woman named Ruth, who had been like a grandmother to many of the younger slaves, pressed a small carved wooden bird into his hand. "For remembering," she said, "for remembering that you could fly when so many of us can't." As dawn approached, Edmund arrived with a closed carriage and the promised papers. He handed them to Samuel without a word, his face a mask of disgust. The journey to Charleston was tense and silent. Samuel sat across from Edmund, acutely aware that this man could still betray him at any moment, could have him seized and sold or simply killed. But Edmund, for all his faults, was a man of his word when it served his interests, and right now, getting Samuel safely away served his interests at the docks. As the ship prepared to depart, Samuel stood at the railing, looking back at the city, at the South, at everything he had known. He thought about the 4 women he was leaving behind, carrying his children. He thought about those children who would grow up in a world that would teach them to despise half of what they were. He thought about all the people, still in chains, still suffering, while he sailed toward something that might be freedom. The ship's horn blew, and Samuel felt the deck shift beneath his feet as they began to move. As Charleston grew smaller in the distance, he opened his hand and looked at the carved bird Ruth had given him. It was simple, rough, but undeniably a bird in flight. He closed his fist around it and made himself a promise. He would survive. He would build a life, and somehow, some way, he would find a way to matter, to make this escape mean something more than just one man's freedom. Back at Thornhill, the sisters stood together in the garden, watching the sunrise. They didn't speak about what they had done, about the impossible choice they had made between their survival and Samuel's freedom, between their children's futures and the truth. Margaret's hand unconsciously moved to her belly, where a child was growing, a child who would be raised in privilege and lies. Elizabeth's jaw was set, her mind already working on the story they would tell, the fiction they would maintain. Caroline looked more alive than she had in years, but there was a sadness in her eyes that hadn't been there before, and Abigail cried quietly, mourning something she couldn't quite name. Constance joined them, looking older than she had just months before. "Is it done?" she asked. "He's gone," Margaret confirmed, "and we're committed now. There's no going back." "There never was," Constance said softly. "From the moment I made that first terrible decision, there was no going back." The months that followed were strange ones at Thornhill. The pregnancies progressed, and with them came the carefully orchestrated scandal. Constance let slip to a few key gossips, that her daughters had been indiscreet, that there had been gentlemen visitors, that the family was dealing with the consequences privately. The story spread like wildfire, as they had known it would. The Whitmore sisters became objects of pity and scandal, but not the kind of scandal that destroyed families completely, just the kind that made them slightly notorious, slightly tragic, and ultimately still acceptable in society's eyes, because the alternative was too horrible to contemplate. Edmund played his part, publicly supporting his nieces and sister-in-law, privately seething at having been outmaneuvered. He waited, hoping for some slip, some mistake that would give him another opening, but the sisters were careful. They had learned from their mother that survival sometimes required becoming people they didn't want to be. The children were born in the spring, for healthy babies, 3 boys and a girl. Margaret's son was named Thomas, after his grandfather. Elizabeth's boy was called James. Caroline had a daughter she named Hope, a word that finally meant something to her again, and Abigail's son was christened Samuel, a choice that made her sisters exchange worried glances, but which Abigail insisted on with uncharacteristic stubbornness. "I want to remember," she said simply. "I want at least one of us to remember." As the children grew, they became the heirs Constance had desperately needed. The legal challenges from Edmund faded away. Thornhill was secure, but security had come at a price that weighed on all of them differently. Margaret threw herself into managing the plantation, becoming harder and more businesslike with each passing year. Elizabeth's sharp tongue grew sharper, her anger at the world's injustices finding outlet in bitter commentary that made her both feared and respected. Caroline devoted herself to her daughter with an intensity that bordered on obsession, determined that Hope would never feel the darkness that had nearly consumed her. And Abigail, gentle Abigail, looked at her son and saw his father's eyes, and carried a secret grief that never quite left her. Years passed. The children grew into young people who knew nothing of their true origins. Thomas became serious and studious. James was charming and ambitious. Hope was curious and kind, and young Samuel was quiet and thoughtful, with a way of looking at the world that sometimes made Abigail's breath catch, because it reminded her so much of the man he was named for. The Civil War came as it had too, tearing the South apart. Thornhill survived, though diminished. The slaves were freed, including Joseph and Ruth, and all the others who had lived in bondage on Whitmore land. Some stayed, having nowhere else to go. Others left, seeking family or opportunity, or simply the experience of choosing their own path. In the chaos of war and Reconstruction, the Whitmore sisters sometimes wondered what had become of Samuel. Had he made it north? Had he built the life he hoped for? Did he ever think about the children he had left behind? They would never know. Samuel had disappeared into freedom as completely as if he had never existed, leaving behind only the children who carried his blood and the women who carried his memory. But in Philadelphia, in a small print shop on a busy street, a man who now called himself Samuel Freeman set type for an abolitionist newspaper. His hands, once forced to labor for others' profit, now worked to spread words of freedom and justice. He had married a free black woman named Clara, and they had children of their own, children who would grow up knowing their father's story, knowing the price of freedom. Sometimes, late at night, Samuel would think about the 4 children in the South who shared his blood but not his name. He would wonder if they were kind or cruel, if they had inherited anything from him beyond physical features. He had made peace with never knowing, had accepted that some prices of freedom were paid in permanent loss, but he had also made sure that his sacrifice meant something. He had become a conductor on the Underground Railroad, helping others escape the bondage he had known. He had used the money the sisters had given him, not just for himself, but to fund freedom for dozens of others. He had turned his pain into purpose, not in the end. The story of Thornhill Plantation was not a simple tale of good and evil, victim and villain. It was a story of people trapped in an evil system, making terrible choices in impossible circumstances. Constance had saved her family's legacy by sacrificing her morals. The sisters had secured their futures by participating in their own dehumanization and someone else's. Samuel had gained his freedom by leaving his children to be raised in the very system that had enslaved him. There were no heroes here, only survivors. But perhaps that was the truest story of all. Not the grand narratives of noble causes and clear victories, but the messy, painful reality of people trying to survive in a world that gave them only bad options. The children of Thornhill grew up never knowing the truth of their origins, never knowing that the man who had given them life had been a slave their grandmother had purchased like livestock. They lived privileged lives, benefited from the system that had oppressed their father, and in their ignorance, they were spared the terrible knowledge of what their existence had cost.